I guess for the deaf people, the biggest problem is the lack of communication and communication breakdown, because that means a whole lot. That means that you can't go to a shelter and be understood. You can't go to a domestic violence program and be understood. You can't go any place and be understood without an interpreter, if you can get an interpreter. Most places like this are nonprofit, so they don't have money to pay for interpreters. So that's one big barrier. The other thing is the just lack of just information for deaf people, or really for any people whose language is not English. If you don't have communication, trying to get services is really difficult. So we had one deaf lady who had been abused in several different kinds of relationships with various men, hearing and deaf, and each of those have different kinds of problems that can happen. But the point is that she couldn't get help, really. She would go to a shelter, be very bored. Nobody could communicate with her. She couldn't tolerate the isolation. She would go back with the abuser because at least there she had some kind of connection with somebody. She couldn't go to a domestic violence program because there was nothing. There are only a few in the whole of the country. And there's only one residential program for deaf women in the country in Washington State. So the possibility of getting services is very limited. When she did go to a women's program, there was no interpreters. She could not really be involved in any of the discussions, any of the groups with the other people, just being involved in the environment. So she was housed there, to stay there, but she didn't really get any kind of a help. So when the boyfriend called and said, "Oh, take me back, I'll come back," it was better than staying there and being isolated. So back she went. So the lack of communication is the really big issue, not just not having the interpreters, not having things that are sensitive to deaf people. There are different kinds of issues that come up with deaf people as far as domestic violence. One thing is you can't hide. Everybody knows each other. There's a whole lot about you can't communicate with your family, because most hearing families who have deaf kids, which is most of the time, can't communicate with their deaf adult daughters who get abused. So there's not support from the family. So there's a lot of isolation that happens. There's also specific kinds of problems, like you call the police. The police come, police talk to the hearing husband or boyfriend, and they don't talk to the deaf woman who called and made the complaint. And the deaf woman gets arrested and put in jail because the hearing person has said she did blah, 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 blah. And the woman gets put into jail. This often happens. This is not an occasional thing. This is very typical. Deaf people almost never contact the police because they know that the chances are they're going to end up in jail. So it makes people very hesitant to look for help. So the biggest thing we think that's helpful is if the church can get involved, and if deaf people particularly can know about what kinds of services that they could provide themselves and trying to do it, or helping to bridge the gap to providing services that are provided to hearing people. Some of those services not really appropriate for deaf people, but they're better than no services if you can have the cultural sensitivity to be able to bridge that gap. So it's a difficult situation, both culturally, but mostly language-wise. Lots of barriers. But the church can be involved as far as recognizing the problem, learning more about the problem, being willing to be involved and be the person that's the contact person that person can, who's in abuse, knows they can depend on that person to go to, helping to hopefully make advocating with the places that do provide services to hearing people to be accepting of deaf people and to make the possibility for the services to be provided.
How does being deaf make folks more vulnerable to domestic violence?
Well, the incidence is about twice as much abuse to deaf women as to hearing women. So there's several different things. One thing is you can't squeal so easily to people and get some help. You can't tell the police or your parents or other people. There's the embarrassment that happens in the deaf community. It's a very small community. It's like something happening in a small town all the time. So everybody knows each other's business. So there's no confidentiality. You try to keep it confidential, but it's rough. There's the feeling of if I tell the police about so-and-so, he's going to go to jail. And then what's going to happen to this deaf person in jail? So there's a fear of the person that you love, but maybe don't love, you're going to be putting them in a terrible position of being put into jail, and that you have very mixed feelings about that. And just the lack of help, the lack of information is a whole lot of it. And just the lack of information. Most definitely have no idea about domestic violence. That's why we really wanted to do this workshop, because the deaf people who will be coming are from all over the US, and we're thrilled this is going to be offered to people who are deaf all over the US in different deaf ministries, the United Methodist Church, and other people too, because they're the contact people most of the time that could be involved to provide some sort of help. So there's a lot of sensitivity. So a lot of what we're going to be doing in the workshop, the first hour of the 2 hours of the workshop is going to be some just basic domestic violence information, just sharing a lot of information. The second hour will be much more how we as a church, as members in the deaf community ministries, can provide support for women who or men who are involved in domestic violence.